Metrics are not actually about metrics per se. They're about the vision that we use to see things. Just like the microscope and the telescope don't do the seeing for us, they only help us. The same is true for metrics. And they help us do that in two ways. They help us with both seeing to prove and seeing to improve across four key areas. Now, when we turn to prove, we start with the fact that a lot of times, even though the reason we should do the right thing is because it is the right thing to do, people think sometimes they can't afford to do the right thing. And that's because they misunderstand the value of sustainability. And as Ben Franklin said 200 years ago, bad things flow from misunderstanding the value of things. The reason that happens is that the majority of sustainability's value is submerged, which is why when it comes to new and emerging metrics, we're going to take a voyage of discovery, not to see different places, but to see them with different eyes. We often think of sustainability as something that's the topic of values or stories, like the boy who cried wolf. But even in those cases, if we look with different eyes and different metrics, we can actually see the cost of the boy's dishonesty. Because what is that cost? The loss of the family's entire flock. That's more than they could have gained from using AI to optimize grazing, or feeding the sheep a high-growth diet, or using a consultant for better wool marketing strategies. It's more than all those things put together, and yet it goes uncounted. And that's true not just for fables and stories, but for things like circularity, where the tool and metric of net present value obscures net perpetual value, which is what we need NPV to stand for. We need to measure that value, the value of doing the right thing. For example, using customer science, where one company, over the course of more than 25,000 individuals' responses, was able to see that both for things like shirts and for things that are more technical, like life jackets, values mattered tremendously, with double-digit increases in preference and lower price sensitivity as well. And putting those things into a tool for quantifying the value was millions of dollars. And the same thing is true for talent. One 60,000 person organization's head of CSR said to me, I think our talent benefits from CSR are $3 million a year, but our executives will say 300,000. The problem is the actual benefits were 30 million, 100 times as much as our executives thought. That's why we have to prove. What about using metrics to improve? Metrics are the foundation for improvement. It's good to have high and lofty goals, but we need the foundations under them. The saying goes, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And the corollary is, if you measure it badly, performance suffers. And it's not enough to measure the easy things, like students tutored. We have to measure the things that matter, like graduation or future prospects. And the same is true everywhere that we mistake activity for achievement. Like the easy metrics of scope 1 and 2 GHGs, which we'll hear more about later in the meeting, instead of the true influence of scope 3. It's also that there's a more fundamental problem with sustainability's metrics that means we need new and better ones. Imagine a technology company that says we use a lot of solar, but they don't mention that their product harms the self-image of its users. or provides a safe haven for those who are working to undermine democracy. Clean energy does not wash away dirty deeds. And we need to make sure that we have a full instrument set of metrics that shows that it doesn't. For example, impact science not only talks about the financial value, things like jobs, and the values-driven actions like GHGs, but also the operations of the company and the products themselves, whether they harm their users and the democracy they depend on. We also need to have metrics for catalytic effect, because although this is hidden, it can be tremendous. Take, for example, a pharmaceutical firm that donates medicine in Africa. Of course, it helps the health of the person who takes the medicine, but it also helps the family's health, because now that person can work more and more income equals to more health. But it also helps with gender equity. Why? Because the UN tells us if someone in that family is sick, who is most likely to stay home with them? A girl. And she's vastly more likely to go to school if that person isn't sick. And that also helps with the climate, because as Project Drawdown points out, one of the top 5 ways to help solve the climate crisis is to improve the lot of women and girls. In smaller areas, more technical areas like plastic, we see the same problem with our metrics not providing good enough eyes. The old measure for plastic impact, how much? This many tons of plastic. But some is toxic, and some is creating an eyesore in New Jersey, while some is destroying a fishery 1 million people depend on in Kerala, India. We need to include how bad, not just how much, across all 12 dimensions of plastic impact. The same is also true for DEI efforts, where we look at things like percent of workforce or percent of leadership that are women or underrepresented minorities. But that's not enough, because the first position a person has in a company has a tremendous influence on whether they end up in leadership. And the least diverse departments tend to be the ones with the fastest, most secure pipeline to the C-suite, which means we need to include all of these factors, but we also can't make it too confusing. We need a simple, single metric, like people use for the stock market when they say, how did the Dow do today? Something like the RISE index or some other way of putting everything together. We can also join prove with improve, looking at the quantifiable change in the dollar value of decisions made by organizations that have more diverse decision-making groups, because they can actually see how that changes some of the major risks to decision-making quality and the dollar value that that creates. When it comes to emerging issues, not just making decisions, but seeing what's coming, we all know that some of the top issues of this very decade are ESG and sustainability related. In fact, number 1 is not AI, it's not populism, it's climate. And almost half of the top 10 are ESG related. We need to see that what's next creates risks so that we can prepare for them. We need to see which issues are rising and which are falling across different geographies in different industries, by how much and how fast. And we need to see how we're doing, not just which issues are important, but do our stakeholders believe we are actually doing well on them, or that we are falling behind? Because it's not just us, it's the competitors as well. It's fine to say, here we are, and here's everybody else, and this is kind of what our industry looks like. But then when we make a move to here, what happens? The rest of the industry moves a bit, and then a bit more. For example, 200 food companies over the last 3 years. The average score has gone up, and the spread of the scores has narrowed because people realize they need to do more. When you put emerging issues and competitors together, you get risk. The world's most profitable company is actually not Apple. It's Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabian oil company, with a tremendous profit margin. But it's not the world's most valuable company. In fact, even in today's high oil price environment, it's about as valuable as Microsoft, a much smaller company. Why? One reason: climate and the risk it poses. But it's not just oil companies. Across 16,000 equities over 4 years, Lazard discovered that across geographies and industries, there's a penalty to the PE ratio of publicly traded companies, even those not in oil. And that's part of the total cost of owning your carbon, because make no mistake, we are on the way to owning carbon emissions. If not legally, then at least in the expectations of stakeholders. Part of that cost is the consequence of producing it, and part, and here it joins again with improve, is how do we improve it? And how does that change our overall risk picture across environment, social, governance, and economic issues in different geographies? Putting all of those things together is another way we need metrics to help us. Across the 5 Ps of purpose, the policies, do we have the ones that are now required? Our current performance and our progress, are we moving ahead or falling behind? And finally, our perception of others of our performance. A heat map can help with that, with the light blue being places we're falling behind and the dark blue being places we're ahead and have leadership. Again, this is just another way of seeing through metrics, because overall, metrics are not what really matters most. What matters is the purpose. And our measures of how we're doing on the purpose that animates the heart and the business, that's the vision we need metrics to give us.